Hi, this is Mike, your instructor, and welcome back to Advanced Photoshop. And with this lesson, we're going to be learning some advanced photo retouching techniques. Now, many of you have had some basic experience retouching photos, but sometimes they can prove to be very challenging. And photo retouching is a common task in Photoshop, used by photo labs and photographers, so it's an essential skill. So here we're not only going to learn how to do some advanced photo retouching techniques, but we're also going to show you how to do some hand tinting or hand tinted color effect. We're going to start out with an antique picture, which I've titled Dust and downloaded from Blackboard. Here's our picture. It's an antique photograph, scanned in image, and you can see it's got some issues. Let's zoom in on that a little bit. And you can see that it's got lots of dust spots on it. There's some scratches over here on the face that we'd like to retouch. And the picture over the generations has turned kind of a yellowish color, so we want to restore this to its original image quality. Now you might have used like the clone stamp tool to retouch pictures in the past, but as you can see, with all these dust spots here, you'd spend an enormous amount of time trying to retouch those. So we're going to do this in a little bit quicker way, a little more efficient way. And when we're finished retouching, we're going to hand tint it. If you look really carefully, you can see that there are parts of the picture where there are very subtle shades of color. You see that there's a little bit of tint added to the lips and the cheeks, and the dress is green. Well, this is of course a black and white picture taken in the 19th century, before there was any color methods. And what photographers would do is, after they printed the photograph, they'd come back in with oil paints and paint in a really thin, transparent coat of oil on them to give them a little bit of realistic color. And so we'll do that in Photoshop. We're going to start out by duplicating the layer. Let's go to our Layers panel. And the reason we're duplicating this is primarily because we want to keep in line with non-destructive editing practices, as we've mentioned before. And if I do something to the image which perhaps my customer doesn't like, or if I make a mistake that might not be repairable, then I can always go back to my original image because the original pixels are still preserved. So I'm just going to press Alternate Command J or Option Command J if you're on the Macintosh. Command J would have just copied that or jumped it to a new layer, but holding down the alternate key gives me an opportunity to give this layer a new name. Just call it Dust and Scratches. Now on my Dust and Scratches layer, I want to apply the Dust and Scratches filter. But in case I have to come back and make changes to this image, I'm going to convert the Dust and Scratches layer to a Smart Object. Right-click on the blank part of the layer and choose Convert to Smart Object. Then I will go to Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches. Now in the Dust and Scratches panel, drag your radius slider all the way to the left, and also make certain that the threshold slider is all the way to the left. And you can zoom in a little bit if you like in the preview window. And what I want to do here is drag this radius slider to the right until those dust spots disappear. And I'm thinking that at about 5 pixels they're pretty much gone. Actually probably around 4 pixels. If I drop it down to 3, I'm seeing too many of them still. So let's go ahead and set that at about 4 or 5 pixels. I think will be just fine. Now, of course, having done so, we've lost a lot of our detail in the image. So I'm going to take the threshold slider and I'm going to drag that to the right just until those dust spots start to reappear. And I think there's a whole bunch of them right around on her jaw there. So we're just going to drag this up. And we're getting a lot of them starting to pop back in now. So I'm thinking probably around 14 pixels. Well, let's try 16 pixels. I think that's going to work out pretty well for us. That looks pretty decent to me. And I'll click OK. If it turns out that that's not correct, I can, of course, come back into my Dust and Scratches options just by double-clicking on the Dust and Scratches label underneath my Smart Filters sublayer. Okay, so now we see we got rid of those dust and scratches, or at least most of the scratches are gone, but the dust is definitely gone. But there's been a trade-off. You can toggle this layer on and off again, and you can see even though we got rid of the dust specks, we did that at a price. In other words, what we've lost here is the sharpness in the eyes and the sharpness in the hair, and other details like in the clothing are now nice and fuzzy, which we really need some part of the picture to be in sharp focus. And in a portrait, the eyes absolutely must be in sharp focus, even if nothing else is. So the way I'm going to correct that is with a mask. So on my Dust and Scratches layer, let's click on the Add Layer Mask button. Now what I'm going to do is press D on my keyboard to reset my foreground and background colors to their default settings, black and white. And then I'll press X to swap those colors so that my foreground color is set to black. Then I'll go to my paintbrush, and I'm going to choose a brush that is nice and soft. I have set all the softness, or the hardness rather, down to 0%. And then I'm going to drop the brush size down a little bit here. And I'm going to zoom in on my picture. And I'm making certain that my layer mask is active. You see that it's filled with white paint. I'm going to be painting with black paint on the layer mask. And that's what that's going to do, is going to cut a hole in this mask to reveal the sharper image in our background, our original image back there. Now you want to make certain too that your opacity for your brush is set to 100%. And we're just going to paint over the parts of the eyes to make them nice and sharp once again. You see how that sharpness is returning. You know what's happening, of course, is as I mentioned, the background layer is now showing through this layer at the top. If I turn off my background layer, you see the part of the Dust and Scratches layer that is masked off. You can see there's a little part that I missed, so I'm going to mask that off too. Turn that back on. Now let's go ahead and get other parts of the picture sharp. The nostrils should be sharp, the lips, the curls of her hair, probably some hair back here would be nice. The edges of the hair would be really good if it were nice and sharp, just to give some definition to it. bring that sharpness back in. And the lace on her dress, let's make that nice and sharp. But now you're noticing probably something else that's happening. As I'm painting that sharpness back in, I'm picking up once again these dust spots. So in this case, I'll press X on my keyboard, and that's going to swap me back to white paint, and then I'll drop down my brush size to it's really small, and I'll just paint over those, and that's going to restore the mask on those areas. And this won't take very long at all because I didn't really have that many dust spots that popped back in. Now I need to fix those scratches up on the cheeks. And here's what I'm going to do that. I'm going to merge these two layers into one, but I want to preserve the original layers. So I'm going to use a shortcut that you won't find in any of our menus up here. I'm going to press Control, Alternate, Shift, and E, or Command, Option, Shift, E on the Macintosh. And what that does is it merges all these visible layers into one layer, but it preserves the original ones. If I had just gone over here and chosen Merge Layers from the drop-down menu, it would have merged the layers into one layer, but it would have also destroyed the original layers. So this keyboard shortcut is really, really handy. That done, I'm going to go to my healing brush tool. And I can just press J to get to my healing brush tools, and Shift J will allow me to toggle through those different tools. And the one that I want to get is the healing brush tool itself, the little band-aid icon, not the spot healing brush tool. And what I'm going to do is move my cursor. Let's get on the right layer. Let's get onto our merged layer here. And move my cursor over into the forehead where we have nice, clean skin tone. And I'm going to hold down my alternate key, of course, or option on the Macintosh, and I'm going to click. And then I'm going to move my cursor over to the scratch portion here, drop my brush size down a little bit, and I'm just going to click and release, or click and make really short strokes. And what Photoshop is doing here is we're borrowing these pixels up in here and we're blending them with these pixels down here. So again, this is going to work really well if I just click and release, or if I just click and drag a short ways. And we're just going to get rid of those scratches on the face. And we've got some down here. Now we're into a darker area of the skin, so I'm going to hold down the alternate key and click in a clean section of the skin over there, and then retouch the areas that are dark. And you've got some scratches on the fingertips. Let's take care of those. And adjust your brush size as you need to. Any other blemishes you see, we'll take care of those as well. Let's take a quick look in the background too. You see there's some, looks like there's some areas that are kind of moldy back there, so let's clean those up. Okay, I think that takes care of that. So you see that very quickly there we have taken care of our dust scratches. Now we need to correct the that yellowish cast that has occurred through the aging of the photograph. Now the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use the average blur filter on a copy of this layer, and then change the blend mode and invert the color, and that's going to neutralize this yellowishness. First of all, let's go to layer 1, the one that I'd merged, and let's go ahead and rename that. Let's just call that repair. And I'm going to copy that layer. Just press Command J. Now when I do my color corrections, I don't want the white background to be considered by Photoshop. So let me zoom out here just a little bit. I'm going to select the background with my quick selection tool. And then I will invert my selection by pressing Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I on the Macintosh. Then I will choose Filter, Blur, and Average. And what that does is it takes all the values in that picture and it's like it puts them in a blender. It just averages everything out. Now let's invert these colors. So I'll choose Image, Adjustments, and Invert, or press Control or Command I. Now there is an adjustment layer for that too, but we're not going to need to concern ourselves with it this time because I know that there won't be a situation when I would need to undo that. Okay, so what that does is it inverts the values. And of course the complementary color of yellow is blue, so now you see that the picture is more of a bluish tone. Then back in our layers panel, let's change our blending mode from normal to color. Now color it runs off the list here so we can't see it, but it's down near the bottom, second one from the bottom. Change it to color. And what that does is it preserves the luminance of the image, the brightness and the darkness. And so all you see is kind of the bluish cast of the image. And then what I'm going to do is take my layer opacity and I'm going to pull that down until that image is neutralized. And it should be right at 50%. Now the color's neutralized, but you see there's absolutely no significant contrast in the picture. You know, no real blacks, no real whites. So we need to correct that. I can do this either with curves or levels. I'm going to use the curves adjustment layer. So open up my layers panel and create an adjustment layer for curves. In the histogram you see that we have no blacks because our data doesn't start until we get over here into the dark gray area of the histogram. And we see that there's no whites either because these areas right here are not present in the image. The lightest value is this light gray. So I'm going to take this point right here, which is my shadow point. I'm going to drag that in until we get to the base of that histogram. And then I'll take my highlight point and I'm going to drag that in until we get to the base, just to the base of the histogram as well. And that sets my black points and white points. And then I can click and drag on the diagonal line. I'll drag it up a little bit just to brighten the image. Now this is an antique picture, and oftentimes with those older pictures they deliberately used a low contrast rendering. So you might, I mean this is up to you, but you may have a little bit of lower contrast than you might ordinarily would put in a contemporary image. Okay, so we've adjusted our brightness and contrast there with curves. Now I'm looking at my picture and I still see a little bit of that yellow cast in there, which I didn't really notice before. So I may have to go into my repair copy layer and increase that opacity of the blue just a little bit. I can double click the opacity and just press my up arrow key a few times, maybe setting that to about 55%. Don't want to get too blue, maybe anywhere 53 to 55 will kind of neutralize that for us. The next thing I want to do is restore the color to the image. As I mentioned, there are parts of the image that were originally hand tinted, such as the green dress, her cheeks, and her lips. Now, to simulate this hand tinting effect, I'm going to create a new layer. Let's go to our topmost layer, our curves layer, to make it active. And we'll create a new layer. Alt or Option clicking on the new layer button. We'll call this hand tint. And I'm going to change this blend mode to color, just like what we did with the repair copy layer. And for my foreground color, I'm going to choose a green for the dress. I can go to my eyedropper tool and sample the dress itself, and then open up my color picker, and you can see this is the range of green. This is the green that we've chosen, and I may just want to choose a brighter green. We don't want to get it too intense, nothing really saturated like this, but just kind of a soft, toned green. And I'll paint over her dress with my paintbrush. So what I want to do is make certain that I don't paint over into the white area, so I need to make a selection and drop this out. So let me hide this panel for a second. I'll go to my quick selection tool, select the white background once again, invert the selection, Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I, and keeping that selected and on my hand tint layer, again I'll go to my paintbrush tool, making certain that the brush opacity is 100%, and we'll paint over that dress. Now it's going to look a little intense right now. That's because we've got the brush setting, brush opacity at 100%. But not to worry, I'm going to come back to that and change it here. And the reason I'm setting that at 100% rather than at 20 or 30 or something a little bit more subtle is that if I've got it set at maybe 50% or something like that, and I put one brush stroke down and then I paint another one on top of that, you're going to see where those brush strokes overlap. You won't see that if it's at 100%. And what I'll do to control the intensity of the color is once I've finished painting, I will then drop the layer opacity down to an appropriate level. Okay, so here's my green. I can pull that opacity down to about 30% or so, and see how you have a nice soft green. Now I'm going to move up to her cheeks, switch my foreground color to a nice rosy hue, and just a little bit, that's probably a little bit too strong. In this case here I may want to create a new layer for the cheeks. I think I'll do that. That way I can control the color of the cheeks separate from the color of the dress. So here we can kind of, oops, we've got to change our blending mode back to color. Okay, and again, I get pretty heavy-handed here, doing this intentionally. Because when I drop the layer opacity, in this case here, probably about 25% do the trick. It looks natural. And maybe I'll choose something a little bit darker for the lips. I think I can probably keep those on the same layer because they're about the same brightness. And again, let's tweak that layer opacity. Actually, I think probably around 15% in my case will do the trick. Do a few final adjustments there. What I've just done is I've dropped the layer opacity of the green dress down to 10%, because once I saw this at 100% in my window here, it seemed a little strong. And I've got the cheeks down to about 15%. So at this point I can deselect, and there is my completely restored image. Okay, now let's open up the Walt Whitman picture, which is on Blackboard. And here you see we've got a similar situation. We've got an image of Walt Whitman that needs some repair, dust spots and all kinds of other things going on that need to be fixed, but it's got a particular problem that our other image didn't have, and that is about the upper third of the picture has really low contrast. The bottom third does not. So what we've got to do is correct just the contrast on the upper third without it affecting the bottom half. And we're also going to apply a vignette to this. A vignette is a kind of a darker area around the edges and corners of an image, which focus your attention towards the center. When we're finished with our image, it should look like this. You see that the contrast on the upper third has been improved. We've got the vignetting applied to all four corners. All repair has been made. And also we applied a little bit of colorization to it, because the original image was just kind of a really bland black and white, and we just add a little bit of color, kind of a sepia tone. That gives it a lot of life. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to copy my background layer by pressing Command J. And on this first step, this is where I'm going to increase the contrast on the upper third. I'm going to create a layer mask for layer 1. Now with my newly created mask active, I'm going to press D on my keyboard just to make certain that my foreground and background colors are set to their default settings of black and white, if they're not there already. I'm going to go to my gradient tool. From my gradient picker, I'm going to choose foreground to background. I'm going to choose the linear gradient, setting the opacity to 100%, and make certain that reverse option is not selected. I'll zoom in so I can show you what I'm getting ready to do here. And starting at the top of the image, I'm going to click and drag down, and then I'll press Shift so that I can draw a straight line. And I'm going to drag my cursor to just below his chin, like that. And that creates a gradient mask. Now if I turn off my background layer, you see that I've only got the top third or so of the picture that is revealed. The rest of it is masked off. So now with my gradient mask created, I'm then going to create an adjustment layer for levels to improve the contrast, but I only want to improve it over the top third of the image. So here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to press my Control or Command key and click on that layer thumbnail. That's going to load that part of the image as a selection. Remember, anything that's black in the image will be masked off, so it's only selecting the upper third of the image. Now I'll go to my adjustment layers and I'll choose levels. I could do this with either curves or levels, but I'm going to choose levels. And in the histogram, I'm going to take the shadow slider and I'll drag that till it gets to the base of my histogram on the left. That's setting my black point. And then I'll take the highlight slider and drag that till we get to the base of the histogram on the right to set the white point. And then I'll take my midtone slider and adjust the brightness. And I'm setting it at 0.79. And back in my layers panel, I can toggle that off, and you see how my levels are only affecting the top third of the image because we had only loaded the layer mask as a selection. So we've improved the contrast in just the upper third of the image. Next, I'm going to merge these layers just like I did before. Control, Alternate, Shift, and E. And I'm going to rename this merged layer Walt Sharp. And then I'll copy that layer and rename it Dust and Scratches. And we'll use the Dust and Scratches filter as we did before to get rid of the dust and scratches. And again, I'm just going to convert this to a smart object. I'll just kind of breeze through this because we've covered this already. Looking for the areas where there's lots of dust. And filter, noise, dust and scratches. Set everything to 0 and then bring the radius out. Looks like it's just going to be a little bit right there, 4 pixels. And then we're going to set our threshold up. Increase it till those dust spots start to come back. Then I create a layer mask. Switching to black paint and a paintbrush. I'll then paint in the parts that I want to be sharp. Which include these buttons on his jacket. I want those to be nice and sharp. Sleeves, any other details. I'll let you kind of determine those. But again, it's a male figure, so we want to have a little more sharpness than we would if it were a female subject, but we definitely want those eyes to be sharp. Get those nice and sharp. Get the hair nice and sharp, eyebrows, rim of his hat, so on and so forth. And then in the background, where you've got these larger areas over here, you can clean that up using the healing brush tool. Make certain that we've got the layer thumbnail selected for that. And clean those up. Now I'm not going to show you every single one to do, otherwise it's going to make a really long video. So I'm going to pause the video while I clean this up a bit. Okay, so I finished that retouching part. It's looking pretty good. The next thing I would like to do is create that vignette, and that's again where we darken the 4 corners and usually a little bit around the 4 sides as well. And the way I'm going to do that is by creating a dodge and burn layer. Now we've got dodge and burn tools, but I don't really care for those very much. For one thing, it permanently affects those pixels, and it just kind of makes things look kind of a sludgy gray. But here's our dodge and burn tool right over here. But again, we don't usually use those. There's a much better way to do dodging and burning, and that's with the dodge and burn layer. So I'm going to create a new layer, which I will call dodge and burn. And before I click on OK, I'm going to change the blending mode in the new layer dialog to overlay. And then I'm going to put a check mark where it says fill with overlay neutral color, which is 50% gray. and I'm going to click OK. Now I could have done that manually too, just create a new layer and change the blending mode to overlay, but this is a little bit quicker. And then go to my paintbrush tool and use a large soft brush. I'm going to zoom out here a little bit too. And with my layer opacity set to about 10%, I'm just going to gradually paint in these corners. Actually, I'm going to set that at about 30 or 40%. 10 wasn't quite strong enough. And you see, as I paint with black paint, it's making those edges and corners darker. Notice how large my paintbrush is too. We want to use a large brush to do this. And you can see on the layer thumbnail how it's painting it black, which is the purpose of filling it with gray. Now, why doesn't the gray show up on our layer? That's because when we set the blending mode to overlay, well, overlay ignores gray pixels. We only see black and white. So I'm going to create my vignette just by darkening these corners and the edges a little bit. Now if it's still not dark enough, which in my case it is not, I've painted that as opaque as I can get it, and it's still not dark enough, I can copy my dodge and burn layer. Now it's twice as dark as it was before, and then I can lower the layer opacity to get it back down to something that a little more manageable. And then if I want to lighten an area, I switch to white paint. You can see how it's lightening those areas there that got away from me just a little bit. So again, my original dodge and burn layer here, then I copied it because it wasn't getting quite dark enough on the top, even though I had maxed out my brush setting. And then I used white paint to lighten up these areas where it got too dark, and of course I dropped my layer opacity. One more thing I want to do, and that is to create a little bit of a sepia tone. I'm going to create an adjustment layer for hue and saturation. And I'm going to click on the colorize option, because right now if I change my hue, well, there is no hue in this picture. It's purely black and white, so nothing happens. But if I click on colorize, then it applies color to it. And I can adjust the hue. I'm going to choose kind of a red color. Now I can drag the saturation up to see, what color it really is, but something kind of in the red or red-orange range. And then I'll drop my saturation down to about 15%. It's a very subtle difference, but it's noticeable. That gives it that little bit of life that it needs. Just a slight sepia tone. You don't want to overdo it or look too cheesy. Okay? There's my finished Walt Whitman retouched photograph. Okay, let's do just one more, and this one will be a color photograph that needs some resuscitation. Let's open up colorcorrection.jpg. And as you can see, there's really nothing good to say about this picture, except for the people, of course. Composition is terrible, the lighting is horrible, and of course it's an old color snapshot taken with a box camera, and the colors are all faded. But we're going to try and correct those colors and make it look as nice as possible. At least we don't have any dust spots and scratches to worry about with this one. The best way to correct tonal imperfections is with curves, and we can also use curves to correct our color imbalance as well. So let's open up our layers panel, and we're going to create an adjustment layer for curves. Now again, you see that you've got your histogram down here, and we can first of all see if Photoshop can create the corrections for us automatically. On some pictures it can, just by clicking on this auto button. Some pictures you can't, and then you have to go in and manually do it. So let's go ahead and first of all, we'll go ahead and set our auto options. Let's click this little list button right up here. And I'm going to choose auto options. And in this panel that opens up, let's click on where it says find light and dark colors. And I'm going to click on where it says snap neutral midtones and click OK. Now that's the same thing as me having clicked on this auto button once I've got those options set. And it corrected the tonal range quite a bit. It did nothing for our colors. But you can take a look at your red, green, and blue channels here, and you can see how it has automatically adjusted the brightness for those, the white points for them. And you also see that you've got this white diagonal line, and that is for our lightness and darkness range overall. Of course, our color is still off. What I'm going to do is go over here to these three eyedroppers here. There's a black one, a gray one, and a white one. And I can use these to define black, white, and gray points that are in the picture. I'm going to choose the gray eyedropper, the one in the center. And I'm going to click on a part of the image that I think should be gray. And then it's going to adjust all the other colors in the image based on that one being gray. I'm going to zoom in here just a little bit. And I'm going to click at various parts. I'm going to click on water, and you see that that does a pretty good job. It defines the water is gray, and it brings most of your skin tones and your other colors into the proper range. You might find another part of the image that would be gray. Oftentimes white that is in shadow would be rendered gray. Let's click there. That looks pretty good too. Gives you a little bit more blue in the water than rather than having it be so so dull. Or there's a road over here. I can click on that because that should be gray. And that's a little too on the blue side. So I'm going to go back to this shadow part of his shirt and click on that. And you can see in your histogram what is happening. It is adjusting the contrast of each of these channels. Now I still think I need to open up my shadows. So I'm going to go to this white diagonal line, and I'm going to pull that up to open up those shadow details. Now my highlights are starting to get blown out. So I'll go to the upper range of that same white line, and we're going to pull that down. So we're lowering the contrast. Now I'm also taking this black point slider. I'm going to move that in just a little bit there. Just like that. Until we get some good contrast. And there's our finished image. Very quickly and easily corrected using curves. You could do something similar with levels, but curves is going to give you a lot more flexibility. So submit all three of those pictures to me on Blackboard, and I'll look forward to talking with you again. This is Mike McCrease.